Hey guys, it's Dreamforce here. You know they say that every time you pick Hanzo in ranked, God kills a Kirin? Well, this is Thorin's channel. And every time you pick Hanzo in ranked, Thorin kills a seagull.
Right, this is going to be episode 19 of Watch the Overture. For some reason, this has now become a four-person show. I did explicitly with Yiska discuss the concept of the show when we created it. It was a two-man show with occasional guests. And basically, I don't know why, he's just done that thing where it's like, can I just have two people instead of just one that I would have discussed the same topic with? So, obviously, Yiska, this is going to be the worst episode ever for fans, because if anyone knows anything about people who watch my shows, they are actually obliged to lie and pretend they don't want to ever hear the hosts talk and that they only want to hear the guests talk. And if there's two hosts and there's two guests, I don't know if you know how this works, Yiska, but we're going to have to literally be very frugal with when we speak or face the wrath of that very same audience that, again, definitely doesn't want to hear us ever talk while tuning in to watch shows that we appear upon and constructed and, booked, edited, all that stuff. So how dare we? How dare we, quite frankly, attempt to talk on our own shows? But anyway, I'll just proceed to push straight past that and basically continue to talk whenever I feel like it, even sometimes interrupting some of the best analysts in the world while they're in the middle of saying something really interesting to say some sort of a shit pun. Oh, wait, no, well, that's my other show. My mistake. This is the show where we try and talk about the real topics. And I don't just sit there like some sort of fucking cucked sidekick to Monty who now looks like he's got Vader technology because he insists on putting that microphone in front of his face on their episodes. Even though, logically, if you know anything about how camera setups work, you'd put that to the side, wouldn't you? You'd make it have the same effect of catching your voice, but the angle of the camera would allow you to see the voice. But I just like the way he looks like a shit Darth Vader when the mask comes off at the end, And he's like, "You already did, Luke. You already did." Anyway, enough of that. Funnily enough, in the Overwatch community, he could play the role of like Darth Vader or something. Like people make out like he's the ultimate villain. It's like, come on, man! It's just a guy who fucking went to like.
And apparently he can also force choke players' careers just by his analysis.
I do like that part. I don't know why any pro player or coach would ever imply that the analysts sort of like decide everyone's careers, because that's the sort of like arrogance you should never want to imbue those people with. Like if I hear that, you're thinking you're saying it to me to guilt trip me, like, oh, you're really affecting a lot of the players. That just makes me like, holy fuck, I'm more powerful than I realised.
No.
Let's just flex this muscle. Let's see what's going on here. Let's see if I can get some of these fucking Soul Dynasty players out now so we can get the good. Let's purge already. Let's just get through that phase. Sorry, we'll do this. Yeah, go on.
If you run a team though that is only based on branding, then that's kind of true, right?
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
Indeed. Funnily enough, though, a lot of the teams like that. I don't know if the branding aspect's working. Some would say their own social media access is killing them faster than any analyst ever could in the scene. But enough about that. Enough about that particular team. This is not an episode about that team. So immediately 99% of people who watch any esports content tune out knowing that they're not even being discussed. So our guests for this episode, two of them, is in the bottom right-hand corner. We've got Barroi, who people might have seen on Oversight. I can't remember what episode. It was not that many ago, though. It was a few back. And he is obviously an analyst for the Toronto Defiant, so not a bad team, actually. Ended up being probably better than many expected. Our other guest is Beezy, who used to be... Were you just an analyst when you were with Philadelphia Fusion? What was the title?
Senior analyst. I fought for that title.
Senior.
He got tricked by the better job title as opposed to the job raise, like that old switcheroo,
Yeah.
Exactly. The problem is, senior analyst, if this was like, traditional American sports and the franchise has been around 20 years, that sounds amazing. If it's like the first season of a league, it's like, wait a minute, how does that even work, the hierarchy? And they're like,
yeah. There was no junior analyst.
There was no analyst. Exactly, there you go.
There's just me and my ego.
There we go. That's the team. So, and now obviously moved on from Philadelphia Fusion, and you work for basically the parent company. Give us like a brief overview on that, because when you say like you work analytics for them, it's not the same thing, presumably.
No, so Spectacor Gaming, who's kind of like the parent org of the Fusion. I kind of through the first year of the Overwatch League, I was kind of, because we were a small team, like I was working a lot of business development and like kind of internal social analytics, things like that, because we just didn't have that for the Fusion, we didn't have that department. So over the course of the year, as I did more of those things, I kind of kept campaigning like, hey, like, wouldn't it be cool if we had like a team that did this? And now I do. I have a few very talented engineers working for me. We're working on various projects like across the different teams that we work with, as well as kind of internal things like, actually like website design, things like that. So it's I think it's a better fit, but it's a cool place to be.
So the basic premise for this episode is that Yiska, in fact, I noticed a lot of people have wanted to do this. I know Monty on Oversight wanted to do an episode about stats, but the problem is some people in the Overwatch community are actually mentally damaged enough to think that by coming on our show to just talk absolute shit and or some relevant points about video games, you're making some sort of political statement in the United States of America. Not really sure how that all fits together, quite frankly, but whatever, we'll put that to one side. So this episode, we're going to try and actually have like an interesting discussion about stats, which isn't a joke. Like, I'm not setting that up like, haha, what could you possibly talk about that's interesting with that? Because for anyone who doesn't know, in almost every area I'm aware of in esports, the number one thing that people who are actually experts about the game cry out for is better stats, more advanced stats, like very specific ones. Like, I can already tell you, like in games, I know in Overwatch you guys have a similar problem where like still waiting for the replays and waiting for all these basic functionality. And I always tell people in League of Legends, because they also like, had like a fucking decade without any replays, like the stats were all literally, a lot of people might not know this, the stats in League of Legends were all done by hand, I think until very recently. Like until Blizzard maybe themselves, Riot themselves maybe like implement something in the API. So like every time you saw on websites that had like all the wards plus, some guy had to literally do all that by hand. Now that obviously means nothing to Overwatch people because you've also been doing all of them by hand at one point in time, which is unreal when you consider without a replay, you literally just like, it's like being one of those guys who tells you how good a fucking diamond is and he has to use that device to like look at all the flaws and imperfections. Because one of the things is in CSGO, we actually have a bunch of people who came into that space where there's no restrictions whatsoever and you have access to all the server logs and every action basically. In CSGO, a lot of the public don't even know this. There are like stats betas that I have access to, which were designed basically just to sell to teams, like licenses that you buy into the program, and literally the amount of filters you can place on this stuff is unreal. Like, this is how depressing it is. In those games, the stats go so deep in terms of what you can specify, it actually goes the other way and it becomes mad intimidating. Like, you're thinking like, what the fuck would I even want to break down to that level? Yeah. Like, this player at this spot on this map against this thing. It's like, it actually becomes hard just to come up with the metrics that you want to look up. So obviously in all these other games, people just wish they could be at that level. Like, I know in games like Overwatch, like I say, people, if they're using like the eye test to figure out how good a player is, etc. So if we start there, right, Barroi, obviously as someone who's worked with Winston's lab, this early on was a big hub in Overwatch for exactly that reason. The fact that you guys had some of the stats, etc. Is what I said accurate there? Like, were the stats at Winston's lab also collected all by hand, like manually, basically?
Well, I had a program that basically scanned videos and did all the stuff that you would do by hand just by itself. It's like just some artificial intelligence stuff where it reads the screen and then it says, "Oh, Winston killed Diva" or something like that, and it's basically what you would do with your eyes. It's just like a robot doing it for you. But yeah, that's
only
basically
about kill feeds, right?
Yeah, well, it was a kill feed and the hero bar on top and like what ultimates are up. Very basic things, but what you said is very true, just because like some of those companies that work in other games, especially in Counter-Strike, they reached out to me like a few years ago and tried to do the same thing in Overwatch, but they just gave up at some point because it's not really feasible to do that.
In what context? Like, it's just you can't access the data.
Well, yeah, you can't access enough data to make it really possible to have all those things. So it's like too complicated to code some artificial intelligence stuff that like would read the screen, something like that. It's if there was an open API, then it would make things way easier. Okay. For those kind of companies.
Like Beezy, in your position when you're with Fusion, now when you're with Comcast Spectre Gaming, what is the situation like? Like when you say you're in analytics, how do you generate analytics in a game like Overwatch? Like if in this scenario, like he says here, like basically even the AI program's just doing what a human would do if they sat with a pen and paper and just wrote down the like. Is it very complicated to even get the data in the first place? Like every team had all these analysts. Are they basically all generating the data? Like, is everyone just writing down what happened from a VOD and trying to then work from that?
Yeah, so I think, and I'm really excited to talk to Barroi because I think he's like he's the smarter version of me. So maybe my opinion here reflects a failure, but it kind of early on I realized that the most applicable thing I could do with stats was pattern recognition and trends. So like in League of Legends, like the most useful thing, I think, the most useful pattern you can identify is like jungler gank paths, right? Like that's sure. The most real decision that is made once the game starts, in my opinion. Like so let's say, I'm going up against Team Liquid and I can somehow, pull the tape on every single time that they do a gank, to each lane over, and it's not like then there's gonna be a number which is like, oh, he's this likely to go to this lane, this likely to go to that lane. Like maybe there's a little bit of averages there that help, but like the most important thing is then looking at that video rather than watching 1,000 hours of their gameplay and the solo queue gameplay, just to look at like, hey, 10 seconds on each side, where does he start, where does he end, how does he get there? And for me, when I was working with the Fusion, I'd say that's the most useful thing I did. Honestly, the first thing I did was use Winston's labs to kind of create like compositional reports on each team. So, we're going against London on point A on Nimbani when they're attacking. Here's everything they played for how long, and here's how they did with that, which again was only possible because Barroi and his group did such a good job creating the stats. But the other thing that, we did at some point was kind of parse through the VODs more efficiently. So, you get for the official matches played, you do get some information from Blizzard. Including the VODs as well as some actual numbers and stuff. And so if you use those together, what you can do is rather than have your coaches, your assistant coaches, your analysts, whatever you want to call the people who are going to be watching hours and hours of tape every day, rather than have them watch through it, take down a note like, oh, 1543, talk about this fight because this happened, you can kind of create levers for them. So you could say, hey, like, and I think that and I, feel free to disagree with me here, Barroi, but I think the most comparable thing to the gank path in Overwatch, at least last year, was the way that the Winston and Tracer would set up dives. So, if the enemy is Zenyatta, if we're talking like Volskaya second point, and the enemy Zen's playing high ground in the back, the way that the Tracer and the Winston on the other team are going to decide to attack that person, I think that, like, that's an example of something that was an important decision that was made. And also, turns out, if you basically like use this tool that we worked on to say, show me every time the New York Excelsior Zenyatta died, or the New York Excelsior, frontline killed the Zenyatta, you actually do start to see those trends. So there was never any, I mean, like when I came into this, like I came in from analytics and, economic consulting background, and I was planning on sabermetricsing this shit, where it would be like, without ever watching a piece of game tape, yeah, I would tell you, this is the best player in the world, this is the worst player in the world. But honestly, over time, you just kind of realize that the best thing to do with the stubborn esports people that currently exist and the lack of tools that currently exist is just to kind of take the processes that they're already doing and make them more efficient. So that's kind of that's the route that I found to somewhat usefulness, I think, in the position.
Okay. Yeah, I totally agree with that. I think there are like 3 ways to make statistics or data really useful, and one of those is just I don't know what to call it, maybe like what you just said, pattern recognition, or you use data to filter out specific things you want to look at. For example, how does your Zarya use the ultimate if the enemy has also Zarya ultimate up or something like that, where you basically filter through hours and hours of VODs and just get like a video of let's say 20 minutes of gameplay where exactly what you want happens in just in a loop like 100 times. It's in that way you can like identify mistakes really easily, and I think this is also just really the only way to kind of increase performance, at least using data. This is the only way I can see to to enhance performance from players. Because if you just look at the basic stats and just think, okay, this player doesn't get enough kills, so what do we do about it? Do we just tell him get more kills? That's not how it works, right? That's definitely not how it works. And in those kind of ways, I feel like that, at least when it comes to enhancing performance, really the only way to do that with data is just doing what Beezy just said, just filtering and looking at whatever you want to look at for 20 minutes, and then figuring out by using your own brain what has to be worked on there.
Okay. I mean, what about that then? Let's continue that discussion then. Like how either conceptually you thought stats would work in Overwatch, or how they like just in a like realistic sense, practical sense, are actually applied, because that's one of the things I wondered as well about it as a game, because it has the FPS elements, but it also has like the mobile elements of the team fight. Is like, how much can you even break down the stats? Because for people who don't know, one of the things I think actually makes American sports very unique is almost all the American sports have pretty good stats actually. Like even if they started with like very, very basic ones, like points per game in basketball actually isn't that great. But then they very quickly developed, like in the 80s, 90s, like very advanced stats that, whether you agree with the formula or not, they allow you to in theory pinpoint things that you can't otherwise. Like an example I always give is what actually, one of the probably misconceptions about the NBA, if you follow it closely, is that everyone just shoots 3-pointers now because Steph Curry is really good at 3-pointers, which is actually not the case at all. Like, for anyone who doesn't know, the real reason is that is the victory of the stats nerds, because what happened is a stats nerd at one point in time had to explain, just like someone who's a friend of mine explained to me, and I feel like an idiot that I didn't ever think of this, is everyone used to literally compartmentalize how they thought about basketball. And so, for example, they thought about a 3-point shot as something you only take when you are open on the floor, and you know, in theory, it's like you couldn't get a 2-point shot. And what no one realized is this is a mad thing to even say out loud, because it's actually very obvious if you'd run a very simple piece of arithmetic, which is no one ever realized that as long as you shoot better than 36% from the 3-point line, that is the same as shooting 54% on a 2-point shot. Now that sounds stupid, because if you run that stat, it's just very simple. It's not even very complicated. But the reason the reason I bring that up though is like, no, if anyone had understood this for the last like 50 or 60 years of basketball, the whole game would be different, because basically very few players in the NBA can shoot higher than 54% from 2, but a lot of players can actually shoot quite a high scale, over 36%. So believe it or not, it actually, for like 60 years, I mean, technically the rules are different, you know, but like for a long time, people have basically been playing basketball entirely inefficiently, and just no one knew this. Everyone thought it was about passing to the biggest guy so he could make a 57% shot inside, when actually a million players could have been having impact. So the point there is, sometimes you even could have had an impact, you just couldn't get everyone on board. Like, there's the perception aspect. So what would you say about this topic? Like, when you came into a game like Overwatch, are the metrics like useful enough? Is the data you can actually like calculate? Can it tell you like very specific things like you were hoping would happen, Beezy, of like how you could analyze like how one player plays a position and just the number would tell you if he's more effective?
Yeah, no. I think there were two things like I kind of ran into, which is that, you know, early on there just wasn't the data there. Again, like huge credits to Winston's lab for putting anything out there. But final blows and ultimate usage, you know, while they can be interesting editorially, I think weren't enough to in a game like Overwatch, where it's like, I mean, like, fuck, the whole conversation around Sato right now, where like you have half of the Reddit universe, like, you know, just believing that he's like the main tank, like. The perception of main tanks by like the Overwatch community, it's just been so wrong for so long, because like they get punished for their team. They're the first ones to die because they're out there in the front and they're big, right? And so it's like, you know, you can see like, oh, Sato died first, like X number of whatever. And I'm not saying that doesn't have a place on broadcast or editorially, but like, you know, you're not going to remove a main tank because he's dying first a lot. You're going to look at your team and say, okay, like, why are we losing our main tank before the other side? I don't think we've figured out our magic number yet. I mean, maybe Barroi has, but I doubt he'd share it if he had. I think one of the bigger problems is that, like, to make like baseball and basketball have a lot of one-off kind of one-off experimental events. Like obviously in basketball, the way that your team's positioning to give you more space to shoot is important. So, you know, a good shooter on a team that has 0 other threats, he's just going to get double teamed the entire time. And his shooting percentage is going to go down. And so there is context there. And so you can't just take those like exact numbers of like, oh, his shooting percentage is high or low. But you can do that way easier than in Overwatch where it's, I mean, the refresh rate on the game is like what, like 140 hertz or something. Like that's the tick at which things are happening in the game, and it's so context based where, you know, your Brig being out of position and bashing early, and not forcing the enemy Zarya bubble, so that now they have their bubble and their bash, and all you have is your bubble. Like as the Reinhardt, where do I go? Like, what do I do in that situation where, and it wasn't my fault, but maybe it was my fault because maybe my Brig did an anxiety force bash because I was not positioned well. So it's like, it's this whole thing where I mean, fuck, like maybe brilliant people like Barroi are going to figure out these actual like numbers to represent things. But I think with Overwatch, it's so hard, and it's so team based, and the other thing too is like it's not like every match we're like taking each player, randomizing them onto a team, randomizing them onto a map, randomizing them onto, you know, an attacking side. It's these teams only play together. At this point, if you wanted to isolate the impact of Boombox, you couldn't do that. You know, I mean, short of the few games that he was sick out for, which is not enough data to do anything, because he's been Philadelphia Fusion, same thing with Neptuno, same thing with Carpe. You know, it's just like there's not the ability to do what you'd want to do, which is like, you know, what I'd love to do is take each player, randomly throw them on a team, do that 1,000,000 times, and then you can maybe, with the numbers that we have in terms of like healing done, damage done, like, you know, CC created, like then maybe you could start reading those numbers. But right now, no, that was a bit of a rant, but
it's
good.
It's also very hard in those terms to compare players because, for instance, I remember, I think it was Contenders Season 0, and we were doing like looking at some stats for the broadcast just to give them some bites. And I looked at Grim Reality's kills per 10 with his ultimate, and it was terrible. It was absolutely abysmal. Now, of course, one thing you could say is, okay, obviously he's not good with bombs. Like, that's pretty straightforward. But if you actually went into the games and looked at what he does, he was only using it on divas and was only bombing divas. And that shouldn't count as a kill, I suppose, in stats. Winston Slap didn't have the capability to, you know, say, okay, he demeched there or whatever, right? So that stats on the outside looks like, okay, he's just not good at bombs. No, that like you got to see how that works. And then sometimes I would think that it would work in categorizing players and archetypes. So even though communities are very focused on, okay, what is the composition they're playing, that might be wildly different on how they play. So for instance, Vancouver plays a very different GOATS than NYXL. And in those stats itself, the performance is not represented by the stats. Like maybe Bumper has more first death than Mano in that situation, right? But the question then is, where's the specific breaking point of that type of archetype, how they play that ghost composition, right? So then you have to compartmentalize it even more. Who even plays these other archetypes? So it became increasingly hard to do stats without eye tests. It's practically impossible. And in my mind, it was always like, okay, someone who makes use of stats would probably also have to be an expert at understanding gameplay and be probably very good at eye tests.
Yes. That's actually one area where, just as a quick aside, and Barroi, I want you to comment on this, is like that's one area I know, as I alluded to with the stats programs in CSGO, that I constantly ran into problems, which is when I would talk to the people who created the stats programs, who were all like finance nerds, people with mathematics degrees, etc. Like they knew everything about like their side of the game, but what they didn't know was any of the like deep analytics. Like they weren't an expert basically. And so the problem was that even the way that they would tell me something, I would have to basically do what you just did there, Yiska, and tell them like, well, no, actually, you have to realize like on that map, you know, that player doesn't give them the resources to, you know, like the stats not telling you. Like you're thinking oh look, I've ranked it like 1, 2, 3. And then also the other aspect I want to throw in is I actually even feel like in esports games, a lot of esports games simply do not allow you to ever get a statistically relevant sample size. As in, they would run a stat, right, and they wanted a legit sample size. So what they would say, Barroi, is they'd go, right, what I did is I calculated every single game of Nuke played in the last 12 months, and I said, like, whoa. First of all, that wouldn't even work. Like, every game? So, like, you've now taken the stats of the best teams ever on Nuke, and you've diluted them completely with teams that have barely ever played it. Then on top of that, the best team on Nuke, if you know the way the game works in CS, let's say every month and a half, people have looked at everything they did before, and now they have to switch up what they do. So, like, what's mad is to take what would be a great sample size, you don't realize you've actually basically got no sample size because you've taken all these relevant aspects and collapsed them in a one big pile, and it's like you've taken every ingredient in the shelf and cooked a massive cauldron of it. It's like you haven't at the end got this amazing rich thing. You've got nothing. You've just got a blur of nothing. Like, what would you say on this topic?
Yeah, I totally agree with that. It's even worse in Overwatch because every 3 months or so we just have like a huge patch. So everything you have until then, you can just scrap that completely most of the time because it's not relevant anymore. All the data you just collected, it's not relevant anymore.
I bet every day a major patch drops like that. It's like people don't even know the heartache that all the analysts out there have collected this shit by a hand. It just like, as like one tear just rolls down their face.
You really have to start all over again. That's what makes it so hard. Like, and what Beezy said earlier, I agree with that totally as well because I think it is kind of impossible to just use stats and say, okay, this is the best player in the world. I don't think you can do that in Overwatch. I think one of the 3 ways to use stats is to scout players, but you can only create like a list of players that you want to look at by just looking at their stats, but you can't say, okay, this is my prime target that I want to pick up. You have to have a list and then go through that list one by one by yourself because stats can't do that for you. You can only limit, like if you start with a huge number of players, you can kind of limit that to the kind of player you want to have because you can kind of say, oh, this player is like a more aggressive type or he's obviously better than this other player and just in terms of stats. You can kind of do that if you know how to use stats, but first of all, that's not as easy as it sounds. And second of all, it still doesn't tell you, okay, this guy must be the best pickup we can ever get. No, you actually still have to trial like 10 or 20 players just to figure out if they work with the team, if their style is what you expect, because maybe they only played on like one team before, so you can't really say how much impact the whole team had on their play and on their statistics. It's really hard to make any kind of statistical approach work. So when people approached me before the season started, and some teams were asking for having this person that does what people said does like Moneyball in esports, then I would be like, I would love to do that, right? I would love to be that person, but I just think it's not possible. I might be the closest person that would be the type of guy right now, but it's just so far away from anything you could do in, let's say, baseball or even Counter-Strike. I feel like in Counter-Strike, for example, if you want to build a team from scratch, you can kind of look at statistics and say, sure, okay, I just get like 4 super good fraggers, and then I have to get like one guy who knows how to think about the game strategically and also knows how to make utilities work. In Overwatch, and that's probably even like a bit over exaggerated with what you can do in Counter-Strike, but in Overwatch you can't even get that close. You have to think about, I have to take into account that this Winston player that I might want to pick up always had a lot of resources in his previous team, so if I wanted to do the same with my team, I would have to create the same environment, which would mean I would have to have low resource DPS players, which are kind of passive, and at the same time everyone has to be talking, or at least I have to have like 1 or 2 people who are leading the team mentally and in terms of strategy. There's just at that point all the statistics you just collected are just kind of meaningless.
Yeah, I mean, just to hop in there, I think it reminded me last year of with one of the efforts I led with the scouting was so what Barroi was mentioning earlier with the Winston's Lab. It's called computer vision. It's basically like on the screen at any time is all these shapes, and your human eye could see it. So with a pen and paper, you could write down, oh, Diva killed Winston 1544, but the computer does it for you and automates it. So one of the things I did was when we were building our contenders team is I wrote a script that because Blizzard does not publish ladder data. If you want to get the top 500 in any region, you need to either by hand go down and do that, or you do what I did, which is write a script. So it would capture the player name, position, the SR they had, and importantly, so I think there's a helicopter.
Oh, sorry, we can't hear it.
Okay, perfect. And what their top 3 heroes are. And so what I did is I wrote a script that basically once a day for each of the regions would go through, take pictures of the top 500 ladder, parse it out, and then spit out data. And at the end of that, what you have is you have a list of the top 100 players in each region. But when you do that over time, you can start identifying patterns such as consistency. So if we were looking for a diva player, it's not just someone who at this moment in time is number 1. It's someone who's stayed in the top 15. It's someone who's second most played hero, honestly, oftentimes like Winston. Like it sounds dumb because you're looking for an off tank, but someone who's played that role really well, and this was back in dive meta, so now nothing matters because we all play goats. But it's someone who's played that main tank position as well. Honestly, like the diva's job back in dive was oftentimes to stop the Winston from inting. And so we looked at things like that, and it goes back to this pattern recognition where Barroi's right. From that process that I created, and it was hard because I'm not as good of a coder as Barroi, but from that process that I created, we made a list that would have been very long and arduous to collect. We made a shorter list, but you don't make decisions based off that. I mean, you have to be fucking insane to make decisions that because some guy could be an asshole, or there's quiet players, there's loud players, there's players who there's shot callers who are team fight shot callers, and there's shot callers who are like setup shot callers, right? Like the people, it's like play by play versus color casters, right? Like you have some wonderful, like Rivington, I think in League is one of the best play by play casters in the world, but would not do a great job at color casting because it's not his forte, So there's like all of these crazy things that you don't realize until you actually talk to a player. You get to sit down from their point of view, watch them play in a scrim environment where you can actually control some variables versus like a contenders match where, it could be this like, this org that picked up the players that morning. So there's that kind of rang true with me because I remember writing that script and I was like, this is hilarious that I'm doing this right now because like I work in this very moneyed franchise league and I'm writing a program to take pictures of their game. Because that's what I'm doing right now.
Yes.
It was interesting.
The thing is, we're sort of like most of the time we're currently shitting on stats, saying how they don't work, right? But it's like I think people also need to realize just how awful even the average coach is at aggregating information.
So
their awareness of biases is honestly staggering for some. So their statistics certainly help, right?
No, while I'm kind of shitting on stats, it's just like in terms of the perception people have, like people really think, or at least that's what I feel that people think when they talk to me, is that they think that you can really determine who the best player is and like the best team that you want to build just based on stats, but you can't do that. But it's not like stats are completely useless.
I'll give you an analogy, Barroi. I always tell people this, because I used to be someone who was quite resistant to stats, but actually, if you look, it's actually the divide that exists in traditional sports, is that you had the old school guy who was the expert with the eye test, and the real reason he's resistant to stats is he thinks it's going to invalidate what he does. What he doesn't realise is what you're saying now. He's actually massively, he's the one over-exaggerating what stats can do. You actually want, ideally, a guy like that who also understands the stats and what they mean, because I always say this, to someone who doesn't understand that area, they all think it's some magical wizardry where you put in something into a computer and it just tells you, like, get Jonak for your team. It's like, no, nothing could tell you that. I always say this, that guy thinks stats are the answer. Stats are the question. Once you see the stat, you go, right, what does this mean? What could I find? What maybe would this apply to? So, like, that can only start you on the journey that hopefully then you have someone who's an expert who looks at the game and then does something with the stat.
Yes. So I think there's a way to make stats useful, especially when it comes to team building. I think stats are actually really helpful, because otherwise you would have to look at like hours of odds for every player you think you want to consider for your team. That way you can really limit the pool of players you want to look at just by having an idea and a concept of the team you want to build. Because I feel like there's a certain type of team that does really well in Overwatch, just in terms of the types of players and types of playstyles the players have. There's a certain composition of players that you want to have in your team that will make the team, that will give the team a higher chance to be successful. And I think in that way, stats are actually really useful. But the big problem is that I don't think there are a lot of people who can do that. I literally only know of one other person beside me who I think is able to do that right now, and that's Beezy. I don't know anyone else.
How convenient.
Here.
No.
I don't know of anyone else who would be able to do that. That's why I shit on Wizard Young that much the last time on Oversight, because I don't think he's able to do that, but he's pretending that he's able to do all of that, and people believe it because people have no idea what he's talking about. Because for them, as you just said, it's like magic. So, but having the idea that statistics can do everything for you is just completely wrong. You really have to be intelligent in terms of you have to know how the game works and what you want to look for, and then you can use stats to kind of amplify that ability that you already have, and you can use stats to kind of just enhance your abilities in terms of analysis, but you can't start with stats and then go from there.
Yeah, just I mean, I think Wizard, like, what, and I mean this genuinely, it's gonna sound like a meme, but like, the guy was brilliant at marketing himself.
Of course.
And I think that is like, it's so fucking important, because I mean, there's some brilliant coaches in the Overwatch League that no one's ever heard of.
Yes.
You know, and it's not that they're not incredibly smart. It's not that they're not incredibly useful to their team. Like, if you polled players on their team and say, like, hey, who's the one coach that if they got hit by a bus tomorrow, the team would fall apart? Like, they might name that person, so they get internal recognition, but you know, they don't necessarily go out there and talk to people and get the bits on the Overwatch League actual broadcast of like the typical genius thing, which was like, again, kudos to the guy for going out and making that happen. Like, that's really smart and really awesome. But you know, as far as frontward facing imported things, I think like even if I, like, just to give an example, like even if I were to have found that magic number, like if I would have found that, like that magic little formula, I would never fucking tell a soul about it. Are you kidding me? I would get fired. If I went on a podcast, was like, oh yeah, it's easy. All you have to do is do this. Like, my boss would be like, what the fuck did you just do? Like, are you kidding me? So, I mean, and I think it's the same thing for a lot of these assistant coaches out there who are carrying the teams. Like, they can't go out there and talk about these strategies that they did, because they're real and they're protectable and they're, you know, important. So yeah, I think the other thing that we haven't like kind of touched on yet, and I don't know if you want to go there, but like I think the editorial use of stats is kind of also really important.
Well, I'll tell you what. Well, I'll save that for later. Like, I want to do like more team-related stuff now, but we'll definitely do a section about like how the broadcast uses them, for example, because I would agree that has become like a new trend, which has some spotty results. But anyway, right, for a moment, one thing I want to ask about with teams is, right, if we're talking like about scouting in terms of trying to recruit a player, like, oh, I need X type of player and I'm going to narrow it down from, 10,000 possible people to these minimum people. What about the other aspect of scouting where you have an opponent you're going to play in 4 days and you need to have some basic rundown of tendencies or things he does? Like, one of the things I noticed they always try to do on the broadcast there when they take out a stat and try to do the same thing themselves, like shadow box the teams, is they'll pick one bizarre stat, like, oh, in 5v4 fights at this area, they're winning, and they always try and match that up. And what I always tell people with that is, that actually objectively doesn't work, because that's what they do all the time in sports like combat sports, like MMA. Well, this person has a better striking percentage, but the other guy's better at taking him down. It's like, you literally never know until the 2 people meet, like, which one wins there. Like, in theory, you want to think you can, but no one's ever figured that out. So how much of that can actually be applied? Like, how much value is there in stats when you're trying to scout an opponent and what they're going to do and prepare, basically?
I mean, I think there's quite a bit. I mean, just like that, like the first thing I said is in terms of compositional tracker. Like, it sounds silly because it's not a stat. It's like publicly available information that this team played this comp on this point. Mm-hmm. But if you add a few key levers and you aggregate, it actually becomes useful because the dugout, right? You're sitting in there. We're about to, we practice in scrims. Like we've gone up against this thing. Just giving the coaches a reminder that, hey, on the Kings Row defense, on this patch, by the way, because as Barroi said, like, God, once a stage changes or once a patch changes, like, everything's fucking irrelevant. But on this patch, like, actually, like, they almost always play Orisa, except when they're going into teams that have been playing like the Hanzo or something like that. And then you could say, it informs that conversation a bit in a moment where, as a coach, like, you might have, like, biases is a really important thing because, I think oftentimes these coaches, they might be really smart, but they're not aware of their biases. So, like, they kind of presenting them in that moment with, like, hey, here's a list of everything they played and, like, to what level of success just is important. Like, you're scouting their comps. And then the other thing I'll say too is, I made the gank path metaphor before about, like, the dive setups and how they use that. Yeah. How they're using their grab, if they're doing it defensively, offensively, if they're a team that, like, there's Zarya's, no, I'm going to go back to when Sombra was played too. Actually, the Sombra route to EMP, that's important, right? I mean, you can't check every angle. So if you can go through and say, hey, this Sombra player actually, to come to this point before he pops the EMP, show me all the video 10 seconds before he pops EMP. And now we have a little bit of an understanding of where he likes to come from, what he likes to do. Is he always getting the Zen in that EMP, or is he actually just going for the tanks to go for, like, a quick, not the quick burn down fight, but actually, like, the winning fight? So there's definitely, I guess I've just been parroting what I've been saying all along, but I think in terms of pattern recognition, huge value there if you have the expertise and you have the time to do it. Yeah, I know, Barroi, what do you think?
Yes, I agree. I think I said that at the start. There's like 3 ways to make statistics work. One is what you said at the very start, which is use data to just look at one situation over and over and over again without having to skim through hours of odds. The second is to scout players that you want to pick up for your team. And the third way to make stats useful is to scout opponents, in my opinion. And just having the information of what compositions they play and what they are really good at is so valuable, because sometimes you will just be able to figure out, oh, this team is actually really bad when playing against teams that play non-meta stuff. So maybe instead of just running goats ourselves, we would just want to play triple DPS, even though we might not be super good at it, but this team is just really bad at it, really bad at playing against it. So we should try that out. At the same time, it's like, do we want to play Sombra against this team? And then you can look at statistics and see if they are really good at playing against Sombra, or if they are one of the teams that does poorly against Sombra. And maybe you'll figure out, even though like a coach might remember that one time where their brick player stunned the Sombra out of EMP, and they think, oh, this team must be really good against Sombra. But if you look at statistics and take out all the biases, you might end up saying, oh, if NYXL, let's say NYXL plays against Sombra, they actually lose a lot more than when they play against goats. So we should probably practice Sombra a lot this week just to prepare for them. I think that scouting for opponents is just immensely, that's where stats get immensely valuable. Yeah.
But how do you? And this is just me genuinely curious because I had my own struggles with season one. Like, how do you go to a coaching staff who? How do I put this? Like, the stubbornness that I think exists in esports because it's just been, especially in Overwatch, because it's just been that eye test. Like, I'm not blaming them for having the stubbornness, because for so long they weren't given any other tools, and a lot of these guys were used to be players, so they they have the feel of the game. Like, Barroi, how do you go to your coaching staff and say, assumedly in Korean, hey guys, like, I know you have this plan, but like, trust me, like, we need to practice this. Like, how do you get the buy-in from the coaching staff, let alone the players?
Since the rest of the coaching staff trusts me a lot, it's a lot easier for me to just convey whatever I find in the statistics. And since I'm always also good at kind of reading the game from just an eye test point of view, I can use statistics and just use my eye test to also show them examples in the actual game where I point out that actually what they might think is wrong, and then they will be convinced by what I say.
So, okay, I have two more questions regarding the team stuff, right? So the first one is, we've heard in the run-up to the season, so for instance, if I think back to the Vala thing about beats before team fights in GOATs, and then I also think about the approach that, probably based on stats, that Atlanta has taken in trancing before fights happen and not necessarily saving them for grabs. Do you guys ever had those situations where you'd made like macro decisions? So let's say we're using our support ultimate into this because this is higher win chance specifically for us, specifically against this opponent. Does this at all hold merit?
Yes. Yes, there were times when we did make macro decisions based on that, but then that again came in combination with just showing examples and showing stuff that every normal person would also agree with then. But that is something that so often when a question is asked, or should we rather do this, should we rather do option 1 or option 2, then you can look at stats to just inform your opinion and go from there. You definitely don't want to make a decision, especially because most of the time the differences won't be immense, but it's a great way to inform your decision. And actually, the other way around, I think, is even better. If you make a decision and then look at stats where you decide between two alternatives and you figured out that the thing you decided for, let's say you decided upon doing alternative A, and then you look at stats and see, alternative A might be complete bullshit, then you can go back and see that, alternative A is actually complete bullshit. So it's super abstract to say all that, but I think a great way to use stats in that sense is where you kind of disconfirm whatever belief you have.
Yeah. And I guess the second point, I don't know if you mind me talking about this point, Barroi, but so in the run-up of season 1, you always talked about a specific main tank player that back then had Korean lettering and whatever, and you didn't know who it was, right? And then in the aftermath of season 1, I think even, we found out that it was actually Sado. So for Beezy, who probably doesn't know about this, but Roy was really like smitten with this guy's performances. Like his stats look great. Was that also one of those recruitments where you looked at the stats and said, "Okay, let's scout this guy"?
Yes, definitely. And so it was a very special circumstance, and Sado not being picked up for the start of season 1 was not because of his boosting, it was just because a plan fell apart, basically. But I am glad that he's in Overwatch League now, because this is like the one guy where I think that statistics are just, or for him, the statistics were such an outlier that I always thought that this guy has to be in Overwatch League. So
what was unique about him?
He was just a very aggressive player, but he made his aggression work to an enormous amount. So statistically, I think the biggest standout thing was that he he got a lot of first kills, and his first deaths were kind of low, which is pretty unique, because most of the time, if you have a lot of first kills, your first deaths will also be low, because again, you're a kind of aggressive player. So while you go in to get kills, you will also die more, probably.
Yeah, it's the same with the entry fragger and Counter-Strike. Like,
Yeah.
you can never have a great differential because you have to die to basically potentially get kills yourself.
Exactly, and Sado just stood out so much from the crowd of all the players we trialed back then in this unnamed team, that I was sad that this whole plan fell apart, and I was actually thinking about talking to Overwatch League teams and telling them to pick this guy up, who I didn't know was Sado back then. But yeah, he's in Overwatch League now, so everything's good.
Okay.
What was
What
the
about
process?
yeah, go on.
Real quick, what was the process for you like, Beezy, in recruiting Sado?
So we came in. I think I was hired in September. We started trialing early October, and named Hui from FaZe Clan. We had we acquired those players in him, and it was kind of a clear agenda point at that point for us to get some Korean players. Keep people for Carpe. It was a huge talent region. Honestly, we were the last team announced, so it's not like there was a lot of NA talent, if it existed at the time, to pick up. And so we were just like, hey, Hui, we'd love to run some Korean trials, set it up. And I think Sado, I'm gonna butcher the pronunciation because it's like Do-Young?
Yes, Do-Young.
Do-Young, thank you. That was the time his name, and of course he changed it. And I remember watching those trials, and I saw it. I was just like, oh my god, the way that he would kite in and out of the bubble, just around corners to basically he'd be doing damage all the time. And that was the thing that was weird to me, because you usually see Winston's they'll drop in, jump out. He would drop in and then stay there for longer periods than any other Winston we'd ever seen, and it was just it was really fun to watch. And there was no at that point I did a little exercise. Blizzard provided a scouting grounds kind of document to some teams, and I just kind of did basically an outlier test on various things, and we identified a few players. I think nothing ever came of it, but Sado was definitely, it was we found him, and you watch him play, and he passed the eye test. It was really fun to watch, actually.
Nice.
What about if I don't know if you want to touch on this, but when Yiska brought up that angle of coach bias, one of the problems there isn't even that coaches just by nature are stubborn. It's just the way humans remember things, obviously your brain deletes the 10 times someone dies in a game that are just irrelevant, where they just, they come around a corner and they're not looking, someone shoots them. And then the one time they go around to do something insane, that's super heavily imprinted, because you go whoa, what the fuck? It gets your attention,
Yes.
And I know there's a lot of coaches that if they don't either watch lots and lots of games or don't have people to kind of buffer them a little bit like that, they can definitely become very deluded about either how good or how bad specific players are. What is the pushback in that sense with stats or whatever kind of extra stuff you can do to hopefully complement or bring that back and temper it to some degree?
Well, whenever I see someone have a very strong opinion on something, or even myself, if I have a strong opinion on something, just by looking at the game, I would just look at the statistics for that specific scenario, and then see if what I say is actually true or not. Because if I then look at the statistics and the statistics tell me a completely different story, then I'm like, oh shit, I probably have to rethink about all of that. And the same I do with our other coaches, where if I see someone have a really, really strong opinion and seems really convinced about something, I would first of all look at the statistics, because if I just listen to him, chances that I would agree with it, because what he says sounds right, because I saw the same game as him. So I'm like, oh yeah, actually maybe the Sombra is actually really good at using MP. But if I look at the statistics, I can then see if this is consistent or not, because it might have happened in the last 2 fights, but it might not be as consistent as we would like it to be.
Okay.
Yeah, I think one of the other things that, just back to season 1 when I was actually doing Overwatch stuff, I remember I was watching, I think it was us on Nepal, and I was like, guys, like I feel like we're really bad at holding points. Like we're fucking great at these first fights. We get in there, we'll cap, but I feel like we just give up points like way easier than the other team. Because in theory, like Koth, and maybe I'm speaking for Bro here, like Koth is a statistician's dream, right? Because it's a symmetric event, equal information, equal opportunity, except for that one time that what was it? Ilios was bugged. Equal sides, and it's just like that's an experiment. That's an experiment. So it's really cool for statisticians. But I remember I mentioned that to the coach, like, guys, like I think we need to like work on like holding positions. And I got some pushback. It's like, I was also the new guy in esports. Like I didn't have the background, so I went and I looked and I basically ran some numbers by map, for the stage, and found that like on average, a team that caps first point gets like around like I think it was, and this obviously varied by map, but I was looking at Nepal, like a team gets like 58% or something on average, and we were getting like 25. And look, and that's when I was like, oh, let me go a little bit deeper here and figure out, oh, like actually, the first death, the team that's holding the point on average will like have the first death in a team fight like way lower than the team that's attacking, because the team that's attacking has to commit resources to get there. I mean, if you're holding a point, you're always at an advantage. And generally speaking, and this is another thing about statistics where like nothing's ever true because everything's true. The team that's holding would have ultimate advantage because they cap that point, meaning that most likely that first fight they did more things in, therefore they'll have higher percentages, and so therefore for the next fight they'll like have that little bit of ultimate advantage. That means like 10 seconds in they have their ults put 15 seconds in, which is all a long way of saying I then took that data to the coaching staff and I was like, hey guys, like we're bad at holding points. And at that point it was hey, let's do a VOD session on like, let's just set up like, where do we hold on this point? Like, where do we send our tanks on this point to hold, just to have some sort of plan? And obviously, things go wrong. The team comes at you from a direction you weren't expecting, come back with a comp you weren't expecting. One of the DPS heroes that's never played anymore gets a pick that is just unpredictable because, Saya player's an aimbot, whatever. Those things happen, but that was, again, I was just like, okay, like maybe you don't believe me right away because I don't necessarily have the buy-in yet, but here's some numbers, and that was actually listened to. So I think that was definitely satisfying.
Okay. Right, let's talk then as a closing topic. But whatever time we've got left, we'll see what we can explore on this one. What you alluded to earlier, Beezy, because I think this is an interesting aspect, which is how do stats end up manifesting on the broadcast, and how are they then used there? Because the number one trigger for most pro players and coaches is what they think are narratives that largely only exist with the analyst, and that's partly because they have to tell a story with what they're doing with their analysis. They have to make it, they can't just give like 50 threads of analysis. You got to pick a few and tunnel in on them and try and explain to the viewer, hopefully, why this is relevant and the game's going to play out this way. And so I have to say, from watching a lot of different esports games, some esports have almost been borderline ruined by stats in that sense. Like probably the biggest example would actually be League of Legends, because in League of Legends, they use some of the most vague stats to try and make the most specific point. So for example, a classic stat that they've cited the last few years very heavily in League of Legends is the average damage that someone does in a game, which literally has no controlling factor for in League of Legends, are you playing a poke champion? Did you play a 40-minute game? Does your team set up around, there's a million factors that could make that literally meaningless or incredibly important, depending on if you added in these extra factors. But unfortunately, they will actually bring up a screen that's like, here are the top 10 average damages. Look, and this guy's number 4, so is he doing well? It's like, holy shit, what a question. That, if this was a 4-hour discussion of that, we could start there, mate. But you're saying that at the end, he must be the best. He's top 4, that's a game where I feel like it's almost been negative that they got the stats, because they don't realize it's almost like pushing them further outside of the interesting area of the discussion before they can ever get back. In Overwatch, where do you guys come down on it? Because I know a lot of the pro players get triggered, but I never know always if that's they're just mad that the narrative went against them this week or against the player that they think is better. What's your take on it? It seemed Beezy like you were implying you're not a fan of the way it's used.
Oh no, I think it's great. I think Ben, Captain Planet, does an awesome job. I'm in the Overwatch League Discord, and there's definitely sometimes they'll put up a stat and the players will push back on it. I mean, you see they'll show main tank deaths, in a match where like a team got 4-0'd, and they'd be like, hey, the team that won 4-0 had fewer deaths than the team that got 4-0'd. And I think that's a mistake that was made early on in season 1, and you don't see that as much anymore. I think, you know, they've done a lot of learning there, but I think it really helps make the stakes. So I think Zoe was on broadcast during one of our games saying, hey, when EQO dies first, the Philadelphia Fusion win like 5% of team fights. Now, maybe there's an implicit kind of normative conclusion there, which is that like, oh, he's the cornerstone of the team. And sure, players can get triggered by that. But when you think about what she's actually saying, she's just setting up stakes for the viewer. Okay.
Just
so
to
now
keep that in mind when you see the fight, Sarah, sure.
Mhm.
Yeah, and that's important, especially in GOATs, because like there's so much going on. It's like now as the viewer, I can be aware, oh, if that brig goes down, that's important. So when I see her get low, when I see her health drop to 5%, 10%, I'm excited and I'm aware that this matters. And the stakes for me are more clearly defined, which is really tough in a game like Overwatch. So I think those things are brilliant. I do think that sometimes it's on the broadcast because they'll say too much. Like, you know, in that situation, so he didn't. She was smart. But like sometimes they'll be like, yeah, and that's why he's the best player on the team. And I think more often what happens is that the analysts don't actually say that second thing. And then angry people who are fans read into it anyway because they love, I mean, I'm guilty of this too. I love hearing a narrative that I think is stupid and disagrees with my narrative, right? It feels fucking good, right? It feels so good when someone does that and you get to say, actually. So I feel like Captain Planet and the broadcast team, like it should all be about defining stakes. And it should all be about making the next match that you watch more enjoyable because now you know a little bit more. And maybe you don't know the real truth, and maybe sometimes they overstep with like the conclusions that they draw. But I think generally speaking, it's really important and really helpful, especially in this meta.
Yeah. The problem I have sometimes is with... So it definitely helps a load that Captain Planet is handing out stats and also giving these tables, because I think it's virtually possible to make every single player in the Overwatch League look good by some metric, like you know, armor applied by a brig or something.
Hell yeah,
stuff like this, right? Like there's such a high amount that you're bound to be first in some category. So you just list the 3 things where this guy's very good at, and suddenly he's marvelous, right? So in order to like sort of have this one guy who knows, for instance, how important the specific stats are in that situation, also has a dialogue with teams, sort of sees how do these work, right? I think that definitely adds to the factor. I will also say, and from what I've heard is, okay, stats came sort of into the broadcasting team much more so in season 2. And I think in season 1, it was the case that I personally had the feeling that a lot of the time, much of what was said about players was very positive. So everyone at some point was the top 3 player in his position, right? Now, of course, there is a sort of a rotation in this, because certainly Striker was a top 3 player, and then he wasn't at the end of the stage or season because Tracer was not played anymore, right? But at the same time, it feels like we were very much on the positive side of things, and we're very reluctant to point out bad plays. And as I found out, that was a lot because certain teams kept pushing back based on the narrative, because people like seemingly the analysts on the broadcast were sort of talked down to. So then season 2 comes in and they get stats, and here's the confidence that they get from that. Now, I think it's very good that bad plays are being called bad teams are being called bad in specific situations. But I also think the confidence is probably not warranted based on their reading of the stats. I mean, if you get an impression, for instance, from Captain Planet and like something that is prepared, so let's say Vancouver is very bad at, comparatively bad at Eichenwald, for instance, statistically. That's a fine thing, right? Now, if you get one stat, for instance, like, oh, Sado has the least first kills or something, that doesn't say much about the performance of Sado, but it might to someone that just hasn't really, you know, like the skill set that a shoutcaster has to have, even the color commentators, is like so wide that they can't be stats experts as well, right? So I tend to just like say, okay, that's fine, but sometimes it's it can really change the narrative around a player based on the statistics, how they interpret it. Because the stat itself is not that interesting. The interpretation of it is where the mastery comes in, right?
Yes.
Yeah, exactly. So my opinion on all of the using stats on broadcast thing is that I think it's really neat to have just like something like or this team actually did the most damage any team ever did on King's Row or something like that. I think it's just a cool thing to say, and it's just generating discussion.
Sure.
Where from that people would discuss, did they actually have the biggest stomp ever or something like that, and you can just start from there. At the same time, it's something if they show the whole one player versus another matchup in halftime, it's something I always tell my players, just don't look at it. It's just not important at all. Okay, you did 3,000 damage less, whatever.
Yes.
It doesn't matter. I think it's neat. I think it's cool for viewers and it generates discussion, but when it comes to analyzing gameplay, it's most of the time it's just completely useless.
There has never been once a tweet that started with the man she said you'd not to worry about. You know, that kind of meme.
Yeah.
Never has this been more accurate than a coin flip in the interpretation of that. Like every time it's like, oh, the Winston that won the match actually had more damage. Wow, insane. Like, but of course that is like 50-50 if that's a truth value, if the stats actually tell you who's performed better or whatnot. Like, I think that is very dangerous.
There's a counterexample, but first I want to touch something you said. Like, I think the Eichenwald, that's such a good example of stake setting. So let's say Vancouver is gonna 4-0 DC, right? If I'm the analyst and I'm like, my job, right? If I'm Puckett or if I'm one of those guys, my job is to make the viewer not tune out. My job is to make this seem like it might be a good match. So the Eichenwald thing is really good. I can say, hey guys, like we all know this is going to go one way, but if there's one map where DC has a chance, it's Eichenwald. The other thing I'll say is I think that the player, the match, the cards that are like 1-1, definitely that's where the conclusion is usually like, maybe the broadcasters don't say, there's no one talking over it saying, hey, this guy's better. But when you put numbers next to numbers, the human brain is going to compare them.
Yes.
The one time I actually liked it a lot, I think it was our match versus Atlanta, and they had Neptuno's Lucio numbers up against, is it Massa? I'm not pronouncing that right, I'm sure. But and you know, we had won the map, I think it was on Root. We had won the map, and they had kind of comparable like kills, like kind of comparable deaths. But what you saw is that Neptuno's healing was like a third of what Massa's was. And the reason is, by the way, is not that Neptuno is a bad Lucio, but that guy never is he's always on speed song. And so, you know, there are stats in the game, like, you know, the amount of time spent healing with Lucio, the amount of time spent speeding, the amount of time spent amp boosting, boosting healing and boosting speeding. And so, you know, I think when that card was up there, I was like, oh, that's neat. Like I know, and I love Neptuno. He's probably my favorite player. Like, this guy is aggressive as fuck. He's like spending all of his time on the walls. He'll come down, speed, boot people. He's brilliant. And now the viewer, in theory, has a way to see, oh, that Lucio won, but he healed less. But oh my god, like, look at his offensive assists versus defensive assists. Like, that's a cool thing to do. But so often, because especially in Ghost, so often it just comes down to this team won, and so like the Rhine died first last. And when Rhine dies first, he's not shielding, he's not doing damage, he's not building shatters. If he's getting pressured more, he's not actually going to get the fatty shatter because he has to hold his shield the entire time, versus a Rhine that has space to actually go there and look for those hero plays. So I completely agree with you. I think the card of one player, the card versus another, I think that's the most toxic, and I think that needs to be looked at to make better. Because like if you can go towards the goal of showing difference in play styles, like choices that players make, where Neptuno makes that choice to be more aggressive, then, you know, I think that's the good thing. I think we have to work towards it. I think Ben's really talented, and I think we'll get there.
That's where it's like what I said, like, to me, it's the difference between the stat is the question, not the answer. Because if you put that up and you ask, what is this indicative of? Like, how could the player that won have a lower stat here? And then you explain it. What you've actually done there, basically, is what would be a great piece of analysis without the stat. But would you have been prompted to make that analysis? So that's actually where it can be superior. Because one of the areas I always used to think was rubbish about stats when I did CSGO analysis is I would end up nearly always in the segment. They would be like, what do you think of this then? Top, here's 5 players with these stats. And I would usually spend my time explaining away the stats. Like, well, that first one's kind of legit, because think about how his team plays in this sense. This other one, ignore that a little bit, his team played 3 of the bad team. But what I realized was, actually, that is the ideal scenario, is to have both the stats and the person who sort of breaks them down in that particular manner. So I think if people do that, that's responsible. The problem is, though, that's where you can't, give that information to the guy who's just the host and hope he can deliver it to the viewer. He's just by default probably going to trip up. For example, probably the most misleading one, actually, to tie into Beezy's example, is map win record, because map win record is way less relevant than who you played the map against. You can actually have a losing record on a map that you are very good on, and in fact, as counterintuitive as that sounds, it's because that's also the reason. I mean, I know in Overwatch you don't ban the maps, but in CS, for example, if you are playing a map a lot, odds are there's a very good reason you keep playing it. It's not a map that you purposely go away from. So you always have to look, who did they play? Yeah, exactly. How good is that team on the map? Is that team good against their strengths? Again, if you start as the first point is the stat and then you go from there, you can get somewhere really interesting. If you think that's the end point of the discussion, you can miss a lot.
Yeah. And that's even more rough if you think about how uneven schedules are. Where we have significantly different amounts of games, but also the strength of schedule is nuts different for some teams.
No, what are you talking about? Come on.
Come on.
By the way, that does trigger me, because I always used to hate this in the LCS, if you know that League of Legends, Beezy, where not only did they have best of ones was the game in LCS for a long time, it actually is again now, they've gone back to it. That's how bad League of Legends as a game is. They had to revert back to best of one to keep the fan base. But this is the sickest thing, right, is they would treat each match in how they talked about a team's record as though each match was uniform. And so they would literally do this, Barroi. They would be like, oh, sure, TSM did badly 3 weeks ago, but they bounced back with a 3-0 streak. It's those are the worst teams in the league, though. They would have beaten them anyway. But they make it sound like that was the narrative to the movie, you did badly at the beginning of the movie. They did the training montage where they beat these 3 teams, and now, they're ready for the final boss. It's none of that happened. If you look at the schedule, that's an imaginary storyline. So that's a rough one for me.
Yeah, that's like saying, oh, look, we play I don't know, we play Washington. Oh no, let's say we play Seoul next week and we play them on Kingsrow, but their Kingsrow record is 0-3. We should easily destroy them, right? But then you look at who they played, and they played New York, San Francisco, and Vancouver in Kingsrow, and you're like, yeah. So does this matter? Yeah. No, it's
yeah. And also, I fear, and this is sort of a side point, but I fear, based on meta changes, that schedule might actually be really impactful to some people's seasons.
Yeah, so in Season 1, when basically each stage you played every team, obviously you leave one out. So yes. You played, not every team, but you play everyone but one. That was part of the discussion internally about, do we do, excuse me, mid-stage patches, and part of the reason was hey, maybe not, because let's say, and I think this is the example that I use at least, was let's say there's a Junkrat nerf halfway through a stage, and we played Houston before the Junkrat nerf, and the team that we're competing for that playoff spot plays them after. That's kind of shitty for us, right? Because they have the best Junkrat player in the world, or one of them, on their team, and that would be shitty. So there's a competitive integrity issue there, and I completely agree with you, Yiska. I mean, if you Vancouver 3-3 gods, right? I don't think any of us would disagree with that right now. And if you're a team that gets all of your Vancouver matches later stages, when maybe we're even now where it's not quite goats all the time, maybe that's unfair. But life's unfair, and here's the thing.
Okay.
It's a league. No, but and this is something that I think is important. Is it's a league. Contenders, which was Overwatch esports before, was a group stage tournament, right?
Sure.
Very, and depending on the group you get placed in, you get a different chance. And it's a league in esports has problems for various viewership reasons. I love the major format, by the way. I think that's wonderful. I love when league used to be more like that, but that's a whole other thing. But if there's one thing you can say about a league environment, is that it does, as best as you can, improve consistency and improve fairness in that regard. So yeah, it's definitely, it's not perfect, but I'm I think we just have to accept a certain amount of that and say that, hey, this format that we've chosen is the best one if you care about that, right?
Do you feel that way though in comparison to season 1, like that?
Oh no.
Yeah.
When I say format, I meant leagues generally.
Right.
Okay.
Even in baseball, right? Like, if generally speaking, the way it works is you'll play a 3-game series at a time versus another team, whether home or away. And it's like, just by the way the schedule, on average, the teams that we face were actually in the bottom half of the rotation. So they'll have, like, let's say they have 5 or 6 starting pitchers. They'll put their best 3 at the top, so like they'll take breaks, so they'll go through the rotation. We happen to only face on average, like, we face teams like 4.5 starting pitcher as opposed to their 1 starting pitcher. That's great. Maybe we're a playoff team now because of it. I just baseball has an 165 game season, 162 game season, something like that, and so like you still would expect the better teams to make it. But even here's another thing too, because this is something people are talking about with the Atlantic Pacific thing. Like in baseball, the way that the playoff seeding works generally is you have your division, and if you win your division, you go in. And there's a division that has the Red Sox and the Yankees in it, right? And then there's a division that has a bunch of bumblefuck, Midwest teams that are really bad and have no money, and they still get the berth into the playoffs based on that. Yeah, so it's like there's sports in general is not. It does its best within a league environment to have the best teams finish at the best spots. Like when we did reseeding in the stage playoffs and it confused everyone and people were like, why is this happening? The answer is because you want a finals between the best 2 teams, right? And we can argue about whether it's going to be confusing to fans or it feels shitty to like win a game and then get reseeded into the harder opponent. But at the end of the day, it's going to do its best to create the best possible finals, and that's what we want to do. So yeah, Season one, much more reasonable in terms of that, like, consistency of outcome, but I still think within the league environment, we're fairly good in that mark.
Well, yeah, the big problem with Season 2 is just, again, the patches, right? And the change that would happen between Stage 1 and Stage 4. When I saw our schedule, for example, we are in the same division as Mayhem, so I was like, yay! But then I saw, we play Mayhem in Stage 4 twice. So if we played them in Stage 1, I would be like, that should be easy, right? But who knows what happens in Stage 4? Now they are a full Korean team. Who knows what will happen until then? Maybe they'll
be all Swedish.
Yeah.
Go back.
So it's like, at that point they might be a top 5 team, and if we played them early on, we would have had 2 easy wins. At the end of the stage, at the end of the season, we might have 2 just crazy losses and might not make playoffs because of that. It's just compared to Season 1, it's so different and just in terms of schedule, and that you have to think about who you play for every single stage and kind of hope that not a lot changes between stages.
Sure.
Yeah, but in Season 1, I did a little piece on the schedule fairness, and I looked at things, everything from the amount of hours gap between your 2, because remember in Season 1, everyone played 2 matches a week.
Mm-hmm.
So I looked at the average gap in hours, and like you found that there were, and this is a problem because, by the way, like one of the things I did is I ran a simulation to see how many schedules I could create within the confines that Season 1 appeared to have. Like, you play each team once within a stage, you only play 2 matches a week. There was actually, because of the map rotation pool, you need to play each map on average a certain amount of times. That was one of the flexible levers they had, is that some teams played more maps in that pool. And the answer is there's not that many. There's not, like, it's a closed solution, and there's not that many solutions that satisfy that equation. And especially I even looked at things like, especially at the start of the stage, if I'm going up against your team and we're playing Eichenwald versus you, and my team's played Eichenwald 5 times already on that patch, and your team hasn't, informational asymmetry is there, right? You've seen how we play Eichenwald. We have no idea how you're going to play, because we probably haven't been scrimming because we're going up against each other. So there's a lot of things there that even in Season 1, the inconsistencies, like Dallas, I think Mickey had a tweet like, sucks to finish my Thursday night game or Friday night game at 10 p.m. and play tomorrow at noon.
Yeah.
Very fair point. Very fair point. I mean, you know how it is now, Barroi. Like, after the match is over, you have the media obligations. There's a fan signing. That's the whole thing. Getting the people in the goddamn car, getting them fed, getting them home. Like, it's midnight by the time the team is actually like breaking up. And then the next day, you have to go do makeup. You have to go do sound check. You have to go do all that stuff. So it's like the amount of hours between those matches is really low. And it's just a tough problem to solve. Like, I don't know. I really don't think there are that many viable schedules within the format.
Don't patch the game.
Yeah. Or use more of the calendar year, but of course that is expensive.
So just to be, I mean, like, are you saying you prefer an environment where the patch locks for a season?
Yeah. Definitely.
That's certainly a bold strategy.
So
I guess I appreciate the pureness of the stance. Like, I mean,
the problem is obviously that viewership might go down or something like that because people want a new game or whatever. But
that will largely be the biggest issue there. By the way, it's like, unfortunately, most game devs still want the game to be the one that's like vaguely similar to the one that the fan plays. Even though obviously in Overwatch that's a ridiculous concept anyway with how the comps work, but they still want that, like, the conceit that the fan's closer to the patch than like, for example, if the patch is 5 months old, that's going to be a tough sell.
Yeah, that is. I'm
with you, Barroi, because if I kind of feel like they should be separate entities. Like, the league should be the league, and then the casual game should be the casual game. But the problem is, like, I just don't know if that's the world we live in pragmatically. Sadly,
well, it's not just for fans; it's also for quality practice. I mean, you know, I'm not saying solo queue is an amazing place for players to go and get better, but it is an important part of being able to practice. It's an important part for coaches too, and players too, to like go get ideas, to go get, think about their mechanics and stuff. And yeah, no, I mean, Thorin, you're right. Like, there's this like, especially for balancing, right? Like, you think about Overwatch, which has console and PC. I think it was a few months into the game, the devs were like, hey, we give up. The games are different. We're now going to do balance patches for console specifically. And because I think, like, it was Pharah or like Widowmaker on console was bad. And so Pharah was just like so insanely like running over everyone on console. Same thing with Torbjorn. And so, like, the devs are finally like, hey, we have to make different balances. And I remember thinking, like, oh, this is great. Sure. This is the first time I've seen a dev like be willing to do this. And I think it's so smart. I think it's necessary. And then you think about how that might, I mean, like, if you, what about for if an OWL, they did a 20% healing nerf just across the board. Any health restore, including health packs, whatever, is 20% less effective. Because at the pro level of play, they can do this coordinated goats thing better than the average person on the ladder. Like, maybe that's better. Maybe that creates a game that works better for the casual player and works better for the professional player. But then it's different, and the casters have to let the players know, hey, by the way, we're on an old patch. Hey, by the way, this is happening. When the outcomes that you expect to see don't happen as a viewer, it can be shitty. And also, I mean, people want to watch what they're playing. So yeah, it's really tough. It's not an easy solution. I don't think we can hold patches all season. I think that's insane.
The problem is that very often the interest of the fans runs counter to the systems that are currently set up. So if you think about, for instance, different metas coming in. Okay, we have to accept that fans want different metas, right? Even though I don't necessarily agree with the fact that one patch enforces one meta. I think, like, if Brood War can change after 5 years without a content patch, and suddenly, like, race balance is completely different based on what someone's found out, that probably is also inherently in Overwatch. Maybe it isn't. Maybe Overwatch is actually, and I would consider that an attribute of a bad game, but maybe inherently there are factors within Overwatch that the established meta is just, like, it's A, very easy to figure out what the best meta is, and B, then you can never overtake it again, and then you need balance patches on Overwatch to change that. I'm not sure if we're at that point yet. But the other thing is we have a non-relegation league, and we have a league that has solid contracts, so you can't just fire people for underperforming. So ideally, in a game where you have a lot of patch issues, you want to have a lot of people taking a stab at it. So a lot of iterations, and then the best ideas just bubble up to the surface, and then they prevail, right? But contract structures are in place. You also don't want fans to completely be disassociated from the players. Like, I mean, if you want to be super cynical, you could just say, okay, so I have my contenders team, and they are just going to figure out what the next meta is. And are just going to gamble it all. And then when that actually comes to pass, I don't know how you would gamble that. Would have to have very good educated guesses or inside information from Blizzard, I suppose. But then I'm just going to switch them out and then play them in that specific meta. But because we know for some of those compositions, for instance, for Rank Grouper now, experience is very important. right?
Sure.
So, like in itself, a lot of the time, like the interests of a gaming community, and then like just like the systems that are set up and that are also monetizable, always run counter to each other in the numbers.
Right, Barroi, how about this? Since you brought up this topic, I'll give you the final word on it before we close up the episode. So, do you want to say something final about this?
So I think there are probably two ways to kind of fix it. One way is just to not patch the game, and maybe the solution is to not patch Overwatch at all, not even the ladder part of Overwatch. Just have it stay the same.
You are a true
idealist.
idealist.
Well, I mean, it worked in the past with, like, I think StarCraft wasn't patched for a long time.
Sure.
So why not try it again? But the other way that people would probably accept more is to split the season into 2 seasons maybe, and then have each season kind of separate from each other, where
like splits?
you have splits, or not even splits because you have the World Cup, but like the major system more or less, where both seasons are equal and there's not a World Cup at the end or whatever. Yes. And because both seasons are equal, the patches for those seasons can be different. But I think neither of those options will ever come to pass.
This video was generously supported by Dean Tanglis, Andreas Snazore Westerlund, Butt Pounder 420, JDubs, Chi Mao, Daniel Olivar, Jiangheng Lu, OllieJ, Tobias Bernasconi, NateDOhDoubleG, Alexander Rao, and as always, a special thanks goes out to my main man, Jerky's Minion. Now, do you want to suggest a topic or a guest for my work? Maybe you want to ask me a question for my monthly AMA. Do you want teasers for who the guests are on my upcoming content? Maybe you want to take part in a monthly esports discussion with yours truly. Well, put your money where your mouth is and join the Scrilluminati today at the Patreon link in the description box below.